The ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers and champagne bubbles, every detail carefully orchestrated to scream opulence. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated between clusters of guests, balancing trays of caviar, crystal flutes, and hors d'oeuvres no one could pronounce but everyone pretended to savor. At the center of it all stood Adrian, tall, broad-shouldered, and smugly handsome in his designer tuxedo, his arm draped proudly around the waist of his new fiancée, Celeste, a model whose beauty seemed sculpted for glossy magazines. Cameras clicked, phones flashed, and every guest marveled at the spectacle. Adrian lived for that admiration. He tilted his chin higher whenever a compliment reached his ears. Yes, Celeste has just signed a contract in Paris, he told a circle of men in expensive suits, deliberately loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. We're moving into a penthouse overlooking the Seine. Quite the step up from, well, the past. His lips curved into a smirk, one sharpened by years of hidden disdain. The men chuckled obligingly, their eyes darting toward the doors as if expecting someone. That someone was his ex-wife, Lila. Her name floated in whispered speculation around the room. She was the shadow Adrian had invited tonight, not out of kindness, but from a bitter desire to see her crushed beneath his triumph. To him, she was nothing but a discarded chapter, a plain woman with a modest upbringing who had never fit into the glamorous world he craved. He imagined her arriving timid, overwhelmed by the luxury, maybe in an outdated dress that highlighted how far behind she'd fallen. He pictured her standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd while he flaunted his model bride, her heart breaking as she realized what she had lost. The anticipation of that moment lit his entire evening. Celeste, draped in diamonds and a gown that shimmered like liquid gold, leaned into him and whispered, "Why is she even coming? Doesn't it feel cruel?" Her pout was convincing enough to charm anyone, but Adrian only tightened his grip around her waist, his eyes gleaming. "Cruel," he said softly, so only she could hear. "Darling, it's necessary. She needs to see what she missed. I want her to understand what real success looks like." Celeste tilted her head back and laughed, the sound tinkling like crystal. Guests turned to admire them, envious and approving all at once. Adrian basked in it. Every polished surface in the room seemed to reflect his victory. The chandeliers, the marble floors, even the glossy cover of a magazine on a side table where Celeste's latest shoot graced the page. The grand doors opened, and the hum of conversation dipped, just slightly, like the pause before a symphony. Every head turned, but it wasn't her, not yet. Only another group of business partners arrived, shaking Adrian's hand with rehearsed enthusiasm. The tension snapped back into chatter, though the unspoken expectation hung in the air. When will she come? Adrian checked his watch and let out a short laugh. Always late, he remarked, his voice pitched to carry. Some habits never change. The people around him chuckled in agreement, though more than one pair of eyes flicked toward the doors again, eager for the unfolding drama. He pictured Lila walking in, her expression crumbling at the sight of him with Celeste. That was the moment he craved most, the look of regret. He rehearsed in his mind how he'd greet her, warm, falsely polite, dripping with pity. He'd say something like, "You look well, considering." Or perhaps, "I didn't know they made gowns like that anymore." Little verbal daggers, delivered with a smile. The music swelled as the band shifted into a romantic melody, and Adrian pulled Celeste closer for a dance, leading her. Across the polished floor, they glided effortlessly, the crowd clapping lightly in admiration. He caught glimpses of nods and approving whispers, "What a perfect couple. She's so stunning, he's done well for himself." Each murmur fed his pride. Yet beneath his charm and tailored confidence, there flickered a restless energy. This wasn't just about love or even vanity, it was about control. Lila had once known him without the armor of wealth and success. She had seen him at his weakest, in the days when bills piled on the kitchen counter and he feared the world would overlook him. She had loved him then, but to Adrian, that made her dangerous. Someone who remembered too much. Someone who had walked away with pieces of his truth. Tonight, he needed to bury that memory beneath spectacle, to prove that he had risen above her, beyond her. So he twirled Celeste, flashing a smile that could slice glass, his eyes darting once again to the doors. Any second now, she would appear. Any second now, the final act of his carefully crafted humiliation would begin. The heavy oak doors swung open at last, and the grand hall seemed to inhale all at once. Conversations faltered, the band's melody wavered as if the violins themselves sensed the change in atmosphere. A collective ripple passed through the crowd as Lila stepped into the ballroom, her figure framed by the gilded doorway. She wore a simple, elegant dress of soft navy satin, not the glittering kind that screamed for attention but one that whispered sophistication. It hugged her form just enough to highlight the quiet grace of her movements. Her hair was styled neatly, her makeup understated, yet there was a glow about her, a serenity that made heads turn more than sequins ever could. Still, Adrian's lips curved upward, a predator spotting prey. To him, it was confirmation of what he wanted. She looked modest, even out of place, compared to the sea of luxury. Well, Adrian murmured, tightening his grip on Celeste's hand as if preparing for a performance. Speak of the devil. Celeste leaned in, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She looks quaint. Adrian chuckled, and together they began their slow approach, every step deliberate, calculated to draw attention. Guests shifted aside, whispering eagerly. The ex-wife and the new bride, the confrontation everyone had been waiting for, was about to unfold. Lila, Adrian said warmly, almost theatrically, when they were close enough for his voice to carry. You made it. I was beginning to think you'd lost your invitation. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. Lila's eyes flickered over him, then Celeste, then the glittering ballroom. She gave a soft, polite smile. Traffic was heavy, she replied. Her tone was calm, unshaken, but Adrian heard only what he wanted, a hint of meekness, of apology. You remember Celeste, of course, Adrian continued, gesturing toward the shimmering goddess at his side. Celeste extended a manicured hand, her diamond bracelet winking under the chandeliers. She's been on every magazine cover from Paris to Milan this year. Quite the career, isn't it, darling? He pressed the words like champagne bubbles meant to sting. Lovely to meet you, Lila said simply, shaking Celeste's hand with a gentle firmness that surprised her. Around them, the crowd leaned closer, hungry for drama. Adrian thrived on it. We were just telling everyone about our new penthouse, he said, his voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Overlooking the Seine, the view alone is worth more than most people make in a lifetime. He glanced at Lila, waiting for her to flinch, to show the tiny crack in her composure. But she didn't. She just tilted her head slightly, as though listening with mild interest. Paris is beautiful, she said. Congratulations. The response was not what Adrian had expected, and for a second his smile faltered. He quickly recovered, laughing. Always so gracious. That's what I admired about you, Lila. Even when things were simple. His tone dripped with condescension, the word simple weighted like a stone. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. They caught his implication. She had been the plain, modest wife, the stepping stone to his current life of grandeur. Some chuckled, others looked at Lila with sympathy, as if watching her walk willingly into humiliation. Celeste leaned closer, adding sweetly, you must find it strange, being here. All this glitz and glamour, it can be overwhelming if you're not used to it. She gave a laugh as light as air, one that drew polite smiles from the circle of onlookers. Lila only smiled in return, unshaken. Oh, I think people can adapt to anything, if given time. The quiet strength in her voice unsettled Celeste, though she masked it with another sparkling laugh. Adrian, however, pressed harder. Do you still live in that little house on Birch Street? He asked, feigning casual curiosity. I always said it had character. The crowd tittered at the subtle jab. Lila's eyes softened, as though she were humoring a child. Yes, she said, for now. Her calmness infuriated Adrian. He wanted her flustered, defensive, embarrassed. Instead, she stood there with that same composed expression, like someone who knew more than she was saying. He clenched Celeste's hand tighter, determined to regain control of the moment. Well, he said, flashing his winning smile to the crowd. I suppose it's good you came. After all, it's not every day one gets to see what real happiness looks like. He pulled Celeste closer, planting a kiss on her cheek as photographers snapped. The guests clapped politely, though some exchanged glances. There was a sharpness to his display, a forced edge that betrayed more desperation than triumph. Through it all, Lila remained still, her gaze unwavering. She didn't protest, didn't defend herself. Instead, she simply offered him a smile that was quiet, almost knowing, before turning slightly away to greet an older couple nearby. The conversation shifted, but the unease lingered. Adrian had staged this evening as her humiliation. Yet, as the murmurs of the crowd swirled, there was an undercurrent he couldn't quite name. Something about her composure unsettled people, made them wonder if she truly was the one on display. Adrian didn't notice it yet, too wrapped in his own smugness, but the tide was already beginning to turn. The evening stretched on, a carousel of laughter, clinking glasses, and hushed gossip. Adrian basked in it, parading Celeste like a prized trophy, his every word polished with smug superiority. Yet despite his efforts, he couldn't shake the faint irritation gnawing at him. Lila hadn't cracked, she hadn't stumbled, hadn't flushed red under his barbs. She stood steady, answering politely, her calm demeanor brushing aside his theatrics as though they were nothing more than background noise. He needed more. He needed the final blow. When the band paused for a brief interlude, Adrian raised his glass and announced, "To new beginnings. To finding a love that truly matches one's worth." His eyes flicked deliberately toward Lila as he spoke, the smile stretched wide across his face. The crowd laughed and clapped, but a strange note lingered in the air, something hollow. Lila excused herself quietly, slipping away from the circle of whispers. She moved with unhurried grace, gliding through the crowd as if she didn't hear the murmurs following her. Adrian caught the sight and smirked to himself. There it is, he thought. Finally, she's retreating. But retreat was not what awaited her. Outside, the night air hummed with energy. The city lights twinkled, and at the far edge of the private estate, the low rumble of engines began to stir. Guests still inside the ballroom barely noticed at first, too caught up in their champagne conversations. But then the sound grew louder, thunderous, commanding, until the very windows rattled. People turned their heads, puzzled murmurs rising like waves. "What on earth is that?" Celeste whispered, her manicured hand tightening around Adrian's arm. Adrian frowned, glancing toward the terrace doors. "Probably fireworks," he said dismissively, though his jaw stiffened. But it wasn't fireworks. The roar crescendoed as a sleek, gleaming private jet descended onto the nearby landing strip, its metallic body catching the moonlight like a blade. The sheer audacity of it, landing so close to the estate, so perfectly timed, drew gasps from every corner of the room. Guests rushed toward the wide glass doors, pressing against them to see. The band stopped mid-note. The chatter died, the jet's engines quieted, and from its cabin emerged a figure that made the crowd erupt into whispers. Tall, broad-shouldered, exuding power with every step, he descended the stairs with the ease of a man who owned not just the plane, but the world beneath it. Victor Hale, billionaire jet magnate, a name that commanded respect in every financial circle. His reputation preceded him, private fleets, international deals, philanthropy that made headlines. And he wasn't there for business. As he crossed the runway, his gaze was fixed straight ahead, on Lila, who stood waiting with that same serene composure she had carried all evening. A hush fell over the crowd as realization rippled through them. He didn't pause to greet anyone else. He went directly to her. "Sorry I'm late," Victor's deep voice carried easily across the terrace as he reached her. He bent slightly, pressing a kiss to her temple with unguarded tenderness. Gasps rippled through the guests who had poured outside to witness. Adrian's face drained of color. Celeste's painted smile froze. Lila smiled up at Victor, her hand instinctively brushing against his. "You're right on time." The billionaire's arm circled her protectively, his presence commanding, unshakable. Then, in a gesture that sent the crowd into an uproar of whispers, Victor's hand settled gently on her stomach. The movement was tender, reverent, but unmistakable. Murmurs hissed through the night like fire catching dry grass. "She's pregnant." Adrian's wine glass slipped slightly in his grip, nearly shattering. His jaw tightened until the muscles pulsed. He wanted to laugh, to scoff, to dismiss what he was seeing, but the evidence stood before him, undeniable, radiant, and humiliating. Victor turned, acknowledging the stunned audience with the faintest nod. "Thank you all for taking such good care of my fiancé," he said smoothly, his voice laced with authority that needed no amplification. His use of the word fiancé detonated like fireworks inside the silence. Some guests gasped audibly, others covered their mouths, eyes wide. Just moments ago, they had been pitying Lila, whispering about her modest dress and quiet life. Now, she was revealed as the partner of one of the most powerful men alive, and the mother of his child. Adrian felt every eye on him, but this time not with admiration. Not with envy. Instead, there was pity, directed at him. Celeste's grip on his arm faltered, her practiced smile trembling. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't tell me she was with him." Adrian's throat worked, but no words came. His carefully crafted stage had collapsed in a single moment, the spotlight wrenched from him to shine fully on the woman he had tried to diminish. Lila, radiant in her composure, turned her gaze toward Adrian. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Instead, she offered him the same calm, polite smile she had carried all evening. The difference was that now, that smile was backed by undeniable power, and a love so evident it silenced any further cruelty. The tide had shifted completely, and Adrian was left stranded in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The ballroom had fallen into a stunned, reverent hush. The chandeliers still glittered, the music still lingered in the air, but all of it now revolved around the new center of gravity, Lila and Victor. Where moments ago Adrian had strutted like a peacock, now he stood stiff and forgotten, the smug curve of his smile long vanished. His glass of wine trembled in his hand, while Celeste shifted uneasily at his side, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the spectacle. Victor, effortlessly composed, guided Lila forward into the heart of the ballroom as though the entire evening had been planned for their entrance. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers chasing them like shadows. "That's Victor Hale," someone murmured. "The jet magnate." Another voice chimed in, "She's his fiancée. And she's expecting." The ripples of astonishment only deepened with each passing second. When they reached the center of the room, Victor raised his glass, his voice carrying without strain. "Friends," he began, his gaze sweeping across the glittering audience, "I must apologize for the interruption. I had a long flight, but there was nowhere else I would rather be than at the side of the woman I love." His hand tightened affectionately around Lila's, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The declaration struck like lightning. Applause broke out, first tentative, then swelling until the room echoed with it. People rose from their chairs, clapping, cheering, their admiration turning toward Lila with a fervor that left Adrian pale. Guests surged closer to congratulate her, their words spilling over themselves, compliments, blessings, gushing admiration. Lila, poised and serene, accepted them with the same quiet dignity she had shown all evening. Adrian watched, his chest tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was his night, his grand unveiling, his chance to prove he had won. Yet now, every eye was on her. His voice, once the loudest in the room, had been drowned out by Victor's presence and the undeniable truth of Lila's new life. Celeste tugged at his arm, her voice sharp with panic. "Adrian, do something. We can't just stand here while she steals all the attention." Her perfect smile wavered, revealing the insecurity beneath. "Steals," he hissed, his pride fraying. She can't possibly," but the words withered on his tongue. Because she had. Effortlessly, without lifting a finger, Lila had undone everything he had tried to stage. As if to twist the knife deeper, Victor raised his glass once more. "To Lila," he said. "My partner, my soon-to-be wife, and the future mother of our child. I am the wealthiest man in the room, but with her, I am richer than I ever dreamed." The applause thundered again, echoing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Lila's eyes glistened as she looked at Victor, but there was no performance in her expression. It was genuine, radiant, a love that needed no words. Adrian's face burned. Guests who had laughed at his barbs earlier now avoided his gaze. Some smirked at his discomfort, while others whispered behind their hands, their pity cutting deeper than scorn. He was no longer the star of the evening, he was the jester, undone by his own arrogance. Celeste's grip loosened. Her gaze lingered on Victor with something like longing, then flicked back to Adrian with thinly veiled disappointment. She slipped her hand from his arm, taking a step away as though his proximity embarrassed her. Adrian caught the motion and felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had flaunted Celeste as his triumph, but compared to Lila's reality, she seemed shallow, replaceable, a prop in his failed performance. Lila finally turned her gaze toward Adrian. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. She didn't sneer, didn't gloat. Her expression was calm, almost compassionate, as if to say, "You did not break me. You never could." That silent truth cut deeper than any words. Adrian tried to muster a smile, to salvage some dignity. "Congratulations," he muttered, his voice hollow. But the words rang false in the echo of Victor's declaration. No one heard him, no one cared. The music resumed, swelling into a triumphant melody as Victor led Lila onto the dance floor. They moved together with effortless grace, the billionaire's hand steady at her back, her smile radiant as the crowd circled them in admiration. Flashbulbs popped, guests clapped in rhythm, and the night became theirs. Adrian stood at the edge, swallowed by shadows, his own fiancée drifting farther from his side as she joined the crowd surrounding Lila. He had orchestrated the evening to humiliate his ex-wife, but in the end, he had humiliated himself. The final image seared itself into him. Lila laughing softly in Victor's arms, adored, celebrated, untouchable. And he, the man who had once dismissed her as simple, left to watch as she walked away into a future brighter than he could ever claim. The spotlight had chosen its true star, and it was no longer him.